Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but being a short man, he could not because of the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now, I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." Here ends the reading.
We have been looking for a number of weeks at the subject of generosity in the book of Luke, and tonight we come to the our final treatment of that topic. And in some ways, this passage is a good summary of it all. We've been saying each week that generosity is more pervasive. It's a broader concept than merely giving away your money. So we've talked about the fact that Jesus calls his disciples to radical generosity, generosity in every area of life, pervasive generosity. You should be generous with your, we talked about relational generosity, not being exacting and too critical or unforgiving. We talked about being generous with your home, generous with your time and your gifts, generous with your money. What we get here tonight is a man who comes to grips not only with the importance of being generous with money, but also with his power. Because Zacchaeus was a tax collector, and that does not really convey to our minds what the reality, because when you think of tax collector, you think of what? IRS. And if you work for the IRS, probably you don't tell people what you do at the party for fear of it kind of pooping the party. But this is something completely different, because Israel was a subjugated, conquered country, and the Romans were the colonial empire, the colonists. I mean, they'd colonized Israel, and what they actually did was they plundered it. Now, they weren't so stupid. The Romans got smart. They didn't just come in and loot and destroy places. They kept the economies intact, but then they took all the capital away, sometimes 70, 80, 90%. To call it taxing was a euphemism. Basically, it was like protection money. It was like shakedown, like we'll come and destroy you and kill you and cut off your head if you don't give us 80% of your income, etc. And the people who collaborated with the Romans to carry out this program were Jews who were called tax collectors. And if you notice, Zacchaeus was the chief tax collector. It literally says the arch tax collector. So he was very wealthy, and he would have been very despised by everyone. I have a great commentary on this gospel by Earl Ellis, the commentary Luke on the Gospel of Luke, and he calls this section, he titles it, "The Conversion of a Rich Politician," because Zacchaeus was not just a man of wealth, but also a man of power. And we'll see when we get down to verse 8 that when he comes under the influence of Jesus Christ's grace, he's not only giving away his money, he's also giving away his power. But in order to understand that, we need to understand what this text tells us about Jesus, because in the end, the Bible is primarily about Christ. Oh, it seems to be about everything, all kinds of things. It's about money and power and all sorts of other things. But it's primarily about Jesus. And once it tells you who Jesus is, then it shows you, in light of this ultimate reality of Jesus, how we should regard everything else on earth. Let's see what it tells us about Jesus, and then we'll be able to understand what it tells us about power and money. Excuse me. So, what we're going to do is, first of all, notice the fact that the main point of this passage is that to meet Jesus converts you. To meet Jesus converts you. You can't just get to know Jesus a little bit. You can't just get a little inspiration from Jesus, a little bit of information from Jesus. Zacchaeus here does not simply get informed. He doesn't just get inspired. He gets completely revolutionized. He's converted. You can't know Jesus halfway. There was no halfways. Let's notice, first of all, quickly, the necessity of conversion, the circumstances of conversion, the key to conversion, and then the sign of conversion, which is a changed attitude toward money and power. Got that? The necessity of conversion, the circumstances of conversion, the key to conversion, and then the sign that you've been converted, which is a changed attitude toward money and power. So let's start at the top. We can go through these first three relatively quickly, I hope. But it's very important to see. When Jesus says in verse 9, today salvation has come to this house. And then he adds, for the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. Kathy and I, my wife Kathy and I, were raised in different churches in Pennsylvania, mainline churches, and we heard that some people got converted to Christianity. If you were a Hindu and you wanted to become a Christian, I guess that was a conversion. If you were on Skid Row, if you were in prison, your life was a mess, and you wanted to turn it around, you might have this dramatic, cathartic conversion. But that's not typical. We understood that wasn't typical. That what it meant to be a Christian was to try your best to go to church and to live like Jesus. Try to be a good person and follow the example of Jesus. And therefore, there wasn't some major conversion. Basically, salvation was a process. But Jesus says, today salvation has come to this house. He has been saved. Remember when Jesus talks to Nicodemus in John chapter 3? Nicodemus was not only a very successful person, not a Skid Row person, not a person, not a Hindu, a person who believed the Bible. And he was a very moral person and a very religious person. And Jesus says, you must be born again. You must be born again. Born again means to start all over, revolutionize, converted. You need to be saved. Past tense. And so, when in fact, in verse 10, where it says, the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost, what he's saying is, I've come to convert people. Now, let's just stop there and keep moving on. Let's end right there. But I need to ask you a question. I really have to. When you think of yourself, have you been born again? Have you been converted? Are you saved? I remember when I was first coming to grips in college with the idea that maybe being a Christian maybe I needed to be converted, not just simply try hard to live like Jesus. I came upon this passage in Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. He's got a great chapter where he says, Jesus Christ did not come to make us nice. He came to make us new. And I realized all my life, I thought being a Christian was making yourself nice. And this is what he says in the passage. He says, quote, this is Lewis, quote, niceness, wholesome personality is an excellent thing. But we must not suppose that even if we succeeded in making everyone nice, we should have saved them. Mere improvement is not redemption. Though redemption always improves people, even here and now, and will in the end improve them to a degree we cannot yet imagine. But God became a man not simply to produce better men of the old kind, but to produce a new kind of man. And then he says, becoming a Christian is not like teaching a horse to jump better and better, but it's more like turning a horse into some kind of winged creature. So first of all, there's the necessity of conversion. Secondly, though, we need to immediately talk about the circumstances. We need to look at Zacchaeus' circumstances. And here's why. As soon as you and I hear the word converting, maybe some of you are saying, oh my goodness, I don't know if I've been converted. Why? Because right away you are thinking, when you think of conversion, you think of dramatic, desperate. You think of some dramatic experience, and you think of somebody who's been desperate and at the end of their rope, but that's not what happens here, by the way. What brings Zacchaeus to conversion? Does he come saying, oh, I'm a mess, or I'm loaded with guilt, or what's it say? It tells you. It says a man there by the name of Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector, was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was. He was just curious. He had heard about him. He wanted to go see who he was. And it led to his conversion. C. Everett Koop was the Surgeon General of the United States. Some of you may remember the name from many years ago. He's still alive, actually, though. He's coming up on 100 years old. And I've met him before, and some other people here may know him. But before that, he was actually one of the leading surgeons of his generation. He was a CHOP. He was a CHOP, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia for many years. And he was a tremendous surgeon, a pediatric surgeon. And he was not a Christian, and his wife was. And in the, I think, early 50s, his wife started saying, I really want to take you to church. And she began dragging him to the evening services at 10th Presbyterian Church in Center City, Philadelphia. And he went partly because he was curious and partly because he was saying, hey, okay, make my wife happy, go to church, fine, okay. And he always went to the evening service because he had rounds and he worked during the day on a Sunday. And he describes in his biography, his autobiography, he describes what happened over a period of time. He said when he first started listening to the preacher, Donald Gray Barnhouse, at first he thought that basically the guy was nuts, but that there were these little nuggets of wisdom in the sermon. And as time went on, he said it was interesting, as time went on, the amount of the sermon that was nuts seemed to kind of go down a little bit, and the amount of the sermon that seemed wise seemed to get a little bit bigger. And eventually the sermons not only started making sense, but eventually they started convicting him, making him admit things about his heart, making him say he's not as good a person as he thought he was, helping him to see things that were wrong with him. And at one point, he looked back on about a 12-month period, and he realized that 12 months before, he really didn't believe it yet, and now he did. And he says, somewhere in there, I crossed a line. I started thinking, I started believing it, I started resting in it, I started praying, and he can't remember quite where. Somewhere, he realized he believed it. See, it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. Now, Zacchaeus was able to at least say, this is the day. You know, C. Everett Koop couldn't even tell you the day. He could just sort of tell you the year. But in both cases, they weren't coming out of need. They were accomplished people. They were successful people. They were just curious, but they also were persistent. They were persistent. Why? Look at Zacchaeus. It says he had to climb a tree. Why? Because of the crowd. Now, wait a minute. There's a little bit more than meets the eye here. I want you to know, that some of you do know, that I'm a tall person. And that if I was at a parade, I was standing out here, and some shorter person came up and said, would it be all right if I stood in front of you? I would say, of course, and I would look so magnanimous, but actually it doesn't change my view at all. Short person comes in front, say, I'm making the person feel good, doesn't change my view a bit, okay? I can see right over them. So what I want to know is, why couldn't this man, just because he was short, why do you have to climb a tree? And the answer is in verse 7, they hated him. He was the chief tax collector. They hated him. They walled him out. And he could have just gone home, but he was persistent, and he climbed a tree. Now, to climb a tree also, by the way, was beneath the dignity of a man and of a prominent man. Also, if you know what they wore back then, it meant people having a view. And I probably shouldn't have told you that, because would you please move on in your imagining? But he would have been laughed at. It's the sort of thing a boy would do. He was getting smirked at, but he was persistent. Kenneth Clark, famous art historian who also was the producer of a great series on PBS years ago called Civilization, tells a heartbreaking story to me. I mean, Kenneth Clark is now dead, but in his biography, he tells a story about how when he was living in France, he went into a church, and he was at a service, I think, and he had this incredible experience of God's reality, and he knew God was real. And he knew there's no way he knew it was real. He just knew it intuitively. But then he says this. He says, but wonderful as it was, it caused an awkward problem in terms of action. If I were to follow through on this, I would have to reform. I'd have to change. My family would think I was going mad. So gradually the effect wore off, and I made no effort to retain it. See, what happened was the crowd. If you live in New York City, you're just like Kenneth Clark, you're just like Zacchaeus. The crowd will make fun of you. The crowd will make it hard for you. If you start to show interest, see, Kenneth Clark was saying, if I start showing interest in Christianity and started studying the Bible and going to church, all my friends, my family would say, what is wrong with you? Christianity? You see? He had to climb a tree and he wouldn't do it. He just went home. He wouldn't push. He wouldn't be persistent. And if you will find, see, here's the best circumstances, I think, to find Christ. Not being desperate. Oh, some of you say, but if it hadn't have been for being desperate, I never would have found Christ. Fine. But I do know also that there are people who are desperate, they embrace Christianity, they think, but just like people who are just drowning grab anything, some people just grab Christianity, they don't really get to know Jesus, they don't really see who he is, they don't become attracted to him, and then when the crisis wears off they go. I don't think desperation is the best circumstances in which to find Christ. Here's the best circumstances: intellectual openness, curiosity, and persistence. But under any circumstance, if you live in New York, you're going to need persistence, otherwise the crowd's going to laugh at you. The crowd's going to try to wall you out. Don't let them do that. So, if you have to be converted, and secondly, if the circumstances can be varied. Conversion doesn't have to be dramatic. It can be quiet. It doesn't have to be on the basis of desperation. It can just be on the basis of intellectual curiosity and persistence. Well, then what is conversion? If it's not necessarily a dramatic experience, what is it? What's the key? What is always there? And the answer is beautifully laid out. This is the gospel writer Luke is a tremendous artist, a literary artist, and he puts it in here. It's in verse 5 and 9, but to prepare you for what he says, keep this in mind. Every other religion, if you ask them about salvation, points to something you do. A path, a set of steps, a set of things to do. Always. If you ask about salvation, they always say, do these things and you will live. Do these things and you will be saved. And that's the reason why in every other religion, salvation is only and always a process. You never can say, I'm saved. You can never say, I'm born again. You're always in the process because you've got so much to do, and you can never be finished because you never can completely fulfill the requirements for salvation. So you have to do it all your life, and you can never be sure if you were good enough, and so you keep at it. So there's no past tense. It's all present. It's always a process. And it's also true, however, that maybe the majority of churches in the world have adopted the non-Christian model of salvation as their model. And that's the reason why my wife, Kathy, and I were raised in churches that basically, if you'd asked us, how do you get saved, or what does it mean to be a Christian, you say you just try your whole life to live as good as you can according to the model of Jesus and the example of Jesus. One of the problems with that, of course, is, and by the way, before I get on to that, when I said most churches, it's hard to know, but I do know that recently I was on a website for atheists, and the atheists were talking to each other on this website. And at one point, somebody says, they were trying to talk about what Christians believe, and they said, one thing I can never quite figure out, are Christians, do they believe you're saved through faith or through living a good life according to Jesus' teaching? And they all went into, it was interesting, the atheists all started talking to each other saying, I've never been able to get a straight answer. Because most Christians I talk to say this, but some say this. One guy said, look, I've talked to hundreds of Christians, and I've asked them this, and the majority of them say, you can't just believe, you've got to be a good person, you've got to live like Jesus Christ. So he says, I'm pretty sure that most Christians believe you're saved by your good works, not just by faith. And I think he's probably right. Or she, I didn't look. I'm not sure. In other words, the person who said that was probably right. David Martin Lloyd-Jones, however, has a wonderful he was a pastor and a preacher, and he had a little diagnostic question, which you can use on yourself, or you can use it with other people, as a way to find out whether or not a person, though in a church, had the model of salvation that other religions have. And what he would say is this, and this is taken from a passage, one of his writings. He says, what I would do is I usually would say this to people. I would say, are you willing to say you are a Christian? And very often, people over the years have said, well, I hope I am a Christian, but I do not feel that I'm good enough. And then this is what Lloyd-Jones writes. At once, I know they have no idea of what a Christian is. They're still thinking in terms of themselves. It sounds very modest to say, well, I don't think I'm good enough to be a Christian, but it's a denial of the faith. Did you hear that? It's a denial of the faith. And then he says, this is what he should say. He says, you will never be good enough. Nobody has ever been good enough, but the essence of Christian salvation is to say that Jesus is good enough, and that I am in him. And that's it. There it is. The essence of Christianity is to say, of course I'm not good enough, but he is good enough, and I am in him. And this gets across in the text where? Look at verse 5. It says, I am coming to your house, Jesus says. I am coming to your house. And then in verse 9, what does it say? Salvation has come to your house. And Earl Ellis, who wrote the commentary on Luke, puts it like this. He says, the main point of this passage is where where Jesus is present, salvation is present. Jesus is salvation. Jesus doesn't point to the way of salvation. He is salvation. What does that mean? It means you don't do this and this and this. Jesus saves you by what he's doing, and you embrace him, and then you're in him. Martin Luther understood that, and this is where you get saved. This is what converts you. It's this knowledge, this recognition. It's reeling this and embracing this. Martin Luther tells how he was a monk, he was very religious, but he was wrestling with a sense of not being right with God. And he was wrestling with Romans 1:17. And Romans 1:17 talks about the righteousness of God. And Martin Luther struggled because it looked to him like that what God is saying is, I want you to give me righteousness, and then I will bless you. And Martin Luther didn't feel he was righteous. And then he looked more carefully, and it hit him. Romans 1:17, he says, suddenly he realized that the righteousness God was talking about was not something I give God, but something he gives me as a gift because of what Jesus Christ has done. And he says, when I realized that, I felt myself born again and ushered through open doors into paradise. And then he said, when I realized that law was one thing and gospel was another thing, I broke through. When I understood the difference between every other religion, law was one thing and the gospel was another, I broke through. And that's what happens. That's what happens. That's what changes you. It's that understanding. It might take, when C. Everett Koop says, a year ago, I didn't believe it. This year, I believed it all. This year, somewhere in there, I crossed the line. This is the line you cross when you say, oh, so that's what you do. So that's what's happened. And I want you to see, another way to put this is, Christianity and other religions differ in the order of things. When Jesus says, Zacchaeus, come down immediately, I must stay at your house today, you and I, because we're not in that day and time, don't realize how important that is. You and I say, okay, they're going to, they're eating, they're having a sandwich together, entertainment. No, in that day, hospitality was a big, big, big deal. And when you offered hospitality or you accepted hospitality, it was an offer of friendship. It was an acceptance of friendship, real friendship. You didn't invite somebody into your home unless you were inviting them into your life. And here's what Jesus is doing. Jesus does not say, Zacchaeus, you're a corrupt politician. You clean up your life. You clean up your life and I'll come in. You clean up your life and I'll come into your life and I'll love you. You clean up your life and I'll come in. That's not what he says. He says, I'm coming. I'm loving you. And then as a result, he cleans up his life. Jesus comes first and then he cleans up his life. That's the gospel. When Jesus says, I'm coming to your home, see, that was a big deal in those days. What he was saying is, I'm going to love you in order to make you lovely. Not, I'm going to love you because you are lovely. 'Tis not that I did choose thee, for Lord, that could not be. This heart would still refuse thee, hadst thou not chosen me. My heart owns none before thee, for thy rich grace I thirst. This knowing, if I love thee, thou must have loved me first. That's the gospel. And you notice what happens? He doesn't clean up his life and then Jesus loves him. It's Jesus' love that gives him a joy. Do you see the joy? It's in verse 6. He came down at once and welcomed him gladly. That word means surprise, joy. And down in verse 8, and we're going to get down to verse 8 quickly here, he says, look, Lord, I'm going to make all these changes. Look, Lord. I mean, look at that. You see how the emotion behind it? He didn't just say, Lord, I'm going to do that. Look, Lord. Look, Daddy. Look at what I'm going to give you. Look at what I'm going to do. He's been moved by Jesus' love. And here's why. It cost Jesus something to love him. That's why he's moved. It's not like I'll change, then Jesus will love me. No, Jesus' love changes me. Jesus' love comes first. But it changes me because what? He's moved. Why? because it cost Jesus something. What did it cost him? Well, look at verse 7. The tax collector is a terrible man. Everybody hates him. And so verse 7, it says, the people saw this and began to mutter, he is gone to be the guest of a sinner. And Zacchaeus knows that Jesus Christ's love is costly. It cost him his reputation. It cost him his reputation. He bore the disdain of the crowd. And when you see somebody not just loving you, but loving you at great cost to themselves, that moves you, right? So he saw that Jesus Christ bore the disdain of the crowd, and he loved him at the cost of his reputation. But I mean, I've been very convicted. I'm going to tell you this because when I realized that, do you know how much more this should change our lives knowing Jesus? If this man revolutionized his life just knowing that Jesus Christ loved him at the cost of his reputation, how much more should it revolutionize our lives to know that Jesus Christ loved you and me at the cost of his life, not just at the cost of his reputation? He didn't just bear the disdain of the crowd. Ultimately, he bore death at the hands of the crowd, and he bore the divine justice on the cross when he said, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? He took what we deserve. I mean, if Zacchaeus was changed just by the knowledge that he loved Jesus lost his reputation to love him, how much more should it move you to know Jesus lost his life to love you? And when you see that costly grace, it changes you, and that's how the gospel works. And that's how every conversion always works. It doesn't have to be dramatic, it doesn't have to be desperate, but it always works when you see the difference between law and gospel, you break through, and when you see the costliness of the grace, it leads to life change. And that brings us to our final point, which is what we want to say, in particular in line with the series, the theme of generosity. What is the sign that Zacchaeus has actually been saved? He says something in verse 8 that Jesus says, today salvation has come to this house. Now, Jesus is not saying, now that you're saying 8, I will save you. He's saying, now that you're saying 8, I know that you're saved. What he says in verse 8 is a sign of salvation. What does he say? He says, look, Lord, here and now I give half my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. What do we learn here? Several things. Number one, we learn that Jesus says, here's how you know you really are saved. It changes your attitude toward your money. See, when Zacchaeus says, I have a completely changed view of my money, I want to give it away in eye-popping proportions, Jesus says, that's a sign that you're saved. So, by the way, if you say, oh, I'm a Christian, I believe in Jesus' salvation, but it hasn't really changed you into an incredibly generous giver, you haven't grasped it. You haven't really understood what he's done. You haven't. You might have a mental understanding of it, but it hasn't touched you. Look, this man doesn't even understand yet what Jesus is going to do in order to love him. And he's already changed. And Jesus says, here's how we know that you're saved. It changes your attitude toward your money, but not only that, your power. Because notice the other thing we learned. Here's another thing. Lord, I'm going to give away 50% of my income to the poor, and if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I'll give back 4 times the amount. Now, you need to see how important this is. This is way beyond what's required. In the Old Testament, in the Mosaic Law, believers were required to give away 10% of their income every year to charity, the poor, the ministry, etc. He's offering 50%, not 10. And also in the Mosaic Law, if you cheated anybody, if you defrauded anybody, if you robbed anybody, you not only had to make restitution, but you had to pay back 20% on top of that. So that if you cheated anybody, you had to pay back 120%. He's offering 400% restitution. See that? The law required 10%, I'm giving 50%. The law required 120%, I'm giving 400%. What does this teach us? Wow. First of all, it shows you how a changed heart looks at money. He is not saying, okay, Lord, I'm one of your followers now, so how much do I have to give? How much? He's not saying, how much do I have to give? How much must I give? What is he saying? How much can I give? His attitude is not like, just tell me what I have to do. He's blowing past the requirements. And I want you, this is the first thing. Let's talk about, just for a second, we've talked about it here before, the whole idea of tithing. If you go to the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is talking about the Old Testament law and now what he wants his followers to do, he says, you've heard it said, thou shalt not commit adultery, but I say you shouldn't even look on a person with lust. You've heard it said, you should not kill, but I say you shouldn't even despise or resent people. If you look at what Jesus says, he always says that my followers, the standards of integrity, the standards of love, the standards of purity for my followers are higher than they were before. Because in the Old Testament, people had God, but in the New Testament, you have greater revelation, you have greater benefits, you have more of the Holy Spirit. So because you get blessed more, because the Christians are blessed more than the Old Testament people of God, then all the standards are higher. Which means if in the Old Testament, 10% was considered the requirement of how much you should give away to charity and the poor and ministry every year, then for Christians, 10% is the floor, not the ceiling. It's the starting point. It's just a rule of thumb. And you must, if possible, go on from there. Why? Because we are recipients of so much more. But let me go even further. I believe what he's doing here, the reason he's pressing past 10%, is because he realizes I shouldn't just be giving away my money. I need to be also giving away my power. I should be generous with my power. I should be spreading my power around. You say, what do you mean? Your money is power. The more money you have, the more free you are in the world to live as you want. Put it this way. The more money you have, the more of the world you control. And the more money you have, the more in control in the world you are. That is to say, you are more in control. The more money you have, you're not vulnerable. You got lots of stuff socked away. You can travel where you want. You can live where you want. You can do what you want. You can eat what you want, you can dress as you want. The more money you have, the more in control you are, the more power you have. And the less money you have, the less power you have. Now, I think it's probably true of you too, but I can just confess this. When I think, I'd like to give to that, but I can only afford this much, I realize what I mean by only afford. You can give a certain amount of money without it cutting into your power. You can give away a certain amount of your money. It doesn't really change where you live, what you do, where you travel. It doesn't really change how you live, which means it doesn't, in other words, it's possible to give some money, a little bit. If you're giving 1 or 2 or 3% of your money away, you probably can do that without it actually changing your actual power in the world. But I actually think for most of us, 10% is about the right thing to aim for. Why? Because for most people with most incomes, 10% means you're not just giving away your money, you're actually being generous with your power too. You're losing power. You're sending power out. Not just your money. You can't do all the things you could do before. You are more vulnerable. See, when we talk about sacrificial giving, that's what we are talking about. You're sacrificing power. You're sacrificing living standards. You're sacrificing a certain amount of freedom. Now, if you really believe the gospel, and if you understand what Jesus Christ did, this will not be some of you are out there thinking, oh no. But if you understand what Jesus did for you, Jesus Christ had all the power in the world. Literally. Yeah, this isn't rhetoric. That wasn't rhetoric. He was omnipotent. But he not only became a limited human being, but on top of that, he eventually became a prisoner. And he was in chains, and he was tortured, and he was killed. He lost all power. Why? To give you the only power that matters. John chapter 1, verse 12. As many as received him, as many as believed on his name, he gave power to become children of God. You're heirs of the King in Jesus Christ. That's security. That's freedom. That's something you can never lose. Now, if Jesus Christ lost all his power and he gave away his power in order for us to empower us, then we should not be so afraid to give not just a little bit of money that doesn't really cut into our power, but be generous with our power too. Are you willing to do that? The reason I think Zacchaeus goes past 10% is for wealthy people, you have to. I know too many people who are wealthy that could give away 10% and it wouldn't cut into the power at all. And he knows in order for him to change the way in which he uses power, he was abusing power. He was using power against people. He was accruing power. He's going to start to be generous with his power. And the only way to do that is to give away more than 10%. Here's the last thing I want to say. This sounds like, does it not, In fact, the book of Luke tends to seem like it's so big on social justice and caring for the poor and simple living and give away your money and give away your power. It seems to be kind of down on wealth, doesn't it? Down on wealth. And yet I want you to keep this in mind. How do you feel about rich people? Do you resent them? Do you dislike them? Are some of you rich and you're afraid to even tell people that you are? That you're, this is New York, and very often there's some pretty wealthy people walking around, and you don't want to let people know because people look at you funny or maybe resent you or maybe are envious of you. If you're a Christian, that must go. Here's Jesus, and he's loving a rich man. He's loving a corrupt rich man. He's loving a greedy capitalist, corrupt rich man. He's loving the people that Occupy Wall Street hate. They do. I'm not saying they're always wrong about their public policy stuff, but I can say there's all this anger. Jesus doesn't get like that. He loves the poor. He loves the rich. He doesn't say to the rich man, clean up your act and then maybe I'll have something. I'm coming home with you. He's a God of grace. Kenneth Scott Latourette, who's a church historian, says this about early Christianity. Early Christianity was really, really powerful and explosive. People were coming to Christ everywhere. Why? And this is what he says. He says, a reason for Christianity's success is to be found in its inclusiveness. More than any of its competitors, Christianity attracted all races and classes. Judaism never quite escaped from its racial bonds. Christianity, however, gloried in its appeal to Jew and Gentile, Greek and barbarian. The philosophies never really won the allegiance of the masses. They appealed primarily to the educated, the morally and socially cultured. Christianity, however, drew the lowly and the unlettered, and yet also developed a philosophy which commanded the respect of the scholarly. Christianity, too, was for both sexes, whereas, too, its main rivals were primarily for men. And the church welcomed both rich and poor. No other religion took in so many groups and strata of society. The question must be raised, why did this comprehensiveness appear in Christianity first of all the movements in history? And the answer is Jesus. Let's pray. Our Father, we pray that you would make us pervasively and radically generous. I pray that the Eastside congregation would be famous for its generosity. Of course, that includes money, but we've been looking at that for weeks and weeks and weeks. Jesus gave himself away and everything with it. Teach us to give ourselves away. Move us so we want to give ourselves away. Make us as glad, make us happy enough, like Zacchaeus was. Make us happy enough to give ourselves away. And then teach us how to give ourselves away to each other, to love each other, pour our lives into each other, pour out our gifts, our talents, our time, our treasure. Make the Eastside congregation famous for its generosity. Make the church everywhere that names your name famous in their neighborhood for their generosity. That will bring glory to you and it'll be a wonderful place for us to live to. And we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Obviously, they meet in different places.